Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I'm continuing with Jude. We're in Christminster, which is part 2. And you'll notice that all the parts are kind of organized by where they're at and where they're traveling to. So now he's made it to Christminster, but the first thing I want to point out is, which is really important when you're reading Hardy, it kind of gives you a hint in where he's going with us, and that is the beginning of the chapter and the parts. You usually have a couple of quotes inscribed to them, and one of the quotes I'll show you here is from Swinburne, who was a poet that Hardy really liked. In fact, he learned a lot from reading Swinburne and how to write poetry, and particularly like meters and so forth. But what he liked about him was that Swinburne was not afraid to really tick off Victorians. He wasn't ashamed of his sexuality. His poems sometimes are very sensual, and also they are in many ways, anti-religious, and sounds like he's committing blasphemy, which Hardy would have gotten a kick out of. And I don't know that Swinburne was any more of an atheist than Hardy was, but this was his material. This is what he was kind of obsessed with, but not in a way like he was more easygoing about it than Hardy. He didn't seem to struggle. So he says, "Save his own soul, he hath no star." Okay, so, but let me talk about the second quote, and I'll go back to that. But in the second one, it's actually written in Latin in the book, I think. If that's Latin or Greek, I think it's Latin. And it's from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And it's actually the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, who Shakespeare used as the model really for Romeo and Juliet. Someone once said about Shakespeare that, he could write a good story as long as someone else had written it for him. And that doesn't imply that he didn't write his own plays, because I very much believe he did. But he used the history, he used mythology, he used stories that were already in place, and then he dramatized them in a way with a language that no one else on earth could do like him. But still, that's where he got his material. And these two were star-crossed lovers. So if you've read Romeo and Juliet, you see in the beginning, in the prologue, it says that they are star-crossed lovers. And that doesn't mean a good thing. That doesn't mean that the stars are aligned. That actually means that they're doomed, that they're cursed. So, two interesting quotes here. I mean, you have a reference to two lovers who are absolutely cursed. And then you have Swinburne's sort of facetious remark of, save yourself, save your own soul. You have no star. And if you've read Romeo and Juliet, before Romeo meets Juliet, and he's with his buddies, and he's about to go to this party, which of course they're not invited to, and Romeo has a bad feeling. And he actually says something about an untimely death. And he's looking at the stars, in the play. But then he just says, "Oh, well, steer me, lusty gentlemen. I'll go wherever you lead me. It doesn't matter." But, he has that gut feeling. He knows something wrong is going to happen. Now, what happens is he sees Juliet and he thinks, this is the luckiest day of my life. But within a week, he's going to be dead. So that's, and this is also to bring up the elements of tragedy, because you can't really have a tragedy without something in the universe, you know, going wrong. It's not just that you have a tragic hero and he acts on a tragic flaw, which that's very important. But there's also something very unlucky about this person and about what's going to happen. And so he's kind of relying like on Greek mythology and showing you that the wheel of fortune is not going to be on Jude's side, as it, you know, isn't typically, of course, in tragedies. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out to you. It's good to have a book, which I've lost my cover, so I don't even know what book I really have. I can't really see it, but it has one of those little guys there. To find a book that has a really good deal of notes in the back. A lot of this, pages and pages of it in chapters where he's referring to things like the Bible or the creed or mythology or some poet or some point in history or something like that, because it's very hard for us to, a lot of this probably would have been apparent to people during that time, but for us, we really need to look at the footnotes. And if you're going to read something like this, you may as well go all out, you know, and you're watching my videos, and if you're actually really reading the text and you're looking at the notes, this is going to be an education in itself. You're going to get so much out of this by the time you're done. It's really going to feel good, and in fact, probably a few years later, you'll think, I need to read that book again, and then you'll get a totally new insight in it because you're a little bit older, and that's the way it works. So he gets to Christminster, and Hardy mentions that it's been 10 years, and I think that's important because after Arabella, he was probably 19 when he got married. I don't really know how long he was married because there are only a couple of episodes about it. But 10 years, let's say he's probably approaching 30, which is significant because that's usually by the time somebody is done with college. And he's still trying to get there. So even though he's relatively young, time is not on his side. And, he says, the way he describes him now, that he was, still a young man, forcible, meditative, earnest, rather handsome countenance. He had a dark complexion with dark, harmonizing eyes. And he wore a black beard of more advanced growth than his age, which was a trouble to him because he has, black curly hair, and he's got stone dust, constantly in his hair. And I think that look is what he's really describing is like a professor, or like just a clergyman or priest. I know in the Orthodox Church, Orthodox priests don't actually cut their hair. They actually grow their beard out, and their hair is long, and as they age, they start to look like a ZZ Top band or something, but they look really cool. Also, Orthodox priests marry, so there's some differences between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. So the more ancient tradition is to grow your hair long, and I think that's making a comeback. And speaking of comebacks, I was just thinking of this today. I've noticed that a lot of people on YouTube, whenever I look for something to motivate myself, I've noticed a lot more people are talking about the universe, like the universe has your back, or maybe listen to Eckhart Tolle, which I do and I highly recommend. A lot of talk about consciousness. And what's interesting to me about that is, I grew up like in the 80s, 90s, and nobody ever told me about the universe. Like, nobody ever said anything about law of attraction, or if they did, I would have no idea what they were talking about. But when I was going back and listening to Joseph Campbell, it really, this is no new idea. Joseph Campbell has been talking about kind of being in alignment with the stars, being in alignment with the universe. And how you do that is you follow your bliss. If you're doing something that, you know, that you have a talent for or passion for, something in the universe will conspire to help you, not hurt you. And that's where he said, you know, you've got these invisible hands. And anyways, you know, he's basing all his stuff from mythology, because he studied mythology. So this idea of consciousness is a very old idea. And I just, I find it fascinating that, you know, when I listen to people talk about it, they're not necessarily talking about Joseph Campbell. They're kind of on these ideas. I think it might be interesting to do a video on Joseph Campbell, and not for like AP or anything really serious, but just some of the things that he says is really life-changing. You know, he's the one that came up with the heroic cycle, and he's not just making this stuff up. I mean, he's looking at the patterns that people have. So all that is to say that it's not unusual to look at the universe and see if there's a sign that something's wrong. Like if you're in the wrong place or you're doing the wrong job, you might be getting some kind of message, you know, especially if you feel like there's a lot of resistance, that this isn't working out for you. It's a, you know, you start to feel like King Lear, like the gods are against me. What is going on here? Well, you may be out of harmony with what it is that you're supposed to do. So none of these are really new ideas. I also want to mention Sue Brighthead, since she comes up now as you know, his cousin. And the only thing you really know, Jude knows about her, is he's seen her in a picture. And even in the picture, when he sees her, she's got this hat, and it's probably like, you know, a pretty big, you know, with width, and he compares it to a halo, which is the same way when he's looking at a distance to Christminster. He can't really see it, but that's what he thinks. That's what he thinks of. Which, just on a side note, Romeo does the same thing with Juliet. When he sees Juliet, he, you know, he's always talking about her in saintly terms, this bright angel, and that she's too good for us mere mortals, really. She's out of this world. And the way he sees Sue is very similar, even just from the first sight of her in a picture. And he asks his aunt, remember the crusty old aunt, can I have this picture? And she says no. And she's already a little worried, like, I don't want him to meet Sue. He probably knows there's going to be an immediate attraction and it's going to be a disaster. So she doesn't let him take the photo, but it says that it haunts him. And so I just want to talk about Sue for just a minute before we get back to Christminster. This is what Hardy had to say in a postscript in 1912 in the preface. He described Sue as the woman of feminist movements, the slight, pale bachelor girl, the intellectualized, emancipated bundle of nerves that modern conditions are producing. Okay, there's something, I fell in love with Sue when I read this probably when I was 23, 24 years old. And this was the first time I felt like Hardy, not only did he just come up with a great character, but he totally understands me. You know, he totally understands my hang up with marriage, and it gave me a sense that Hardy actually really knows women. You don't get that sense with Dickens so much, even though he's so brilliant at describing people, to really get inside what is going on here. And the thing about Sue is she's such a contradiction, because she is this free-spirited, intellectualized woman. She's well-read. She's actually even more so than Jude. She's very compatible with him, but yet there's something very Victorian about her. She's a bundle of nerves. She's frigid. And you see that when she's buying these statues of Apollo and Venus, she's rebellious. She's doing this. She's got to go back to her room, which she works in some ecclesiastical kind of store. She does the lettering for some stuff and that they sell, and she lives there, and she's got like kind of like a nun who's running the place, who's very strict. She's already decorated Sue's room with crucifix and icons and all those kind of things. And then here she is buying these pagan, like, you know, almost like pagan gods. And she's proud of it, but at the same time, she's terrified. You know, she doesn't, what am I going to do with this? Where am I going to put it? And, you know, if you read it, you see it takes Jude a while before he's going to, you know, get the nerve to even talk to her. You know, he's just kind of stalking her at this point. And, you know, he looks at her at her job and, you know, sees she must be part of the Anglican church. She sees her at church because she's with her nun boss lady. And his image of her is that she's just a saint. She's just such a good Christian. And later you find that Sue is reading people like Swinburne. I mean, there's a little bit of Hardy in Sue, I think. If Hardy was maybe a woman, and that might be kind of why he's attracted to this type of woman. Now he needed probably someone who was more challenging, more intellectually challenging. And if you look at the description that you get of Sue as a small child, it's always telling when they give you just a little bit of what they were like as a child. The aunt says she could do things that only boys do as a rule. Runs in a muddy pond to her aunt's horror and says, "Move on, auntie, this is no sight for modest eyes." And Kathleen Blake, I get this out of an essay, says, it sheds light on Sue Brighthead's desire to get back to the life of my infancy and its freedom, and to remain as I began. Later on, Jude will describe Sue as almost like asexual. She's more spirit than she is flesh. Now, if you think about that juxtaposed to Arabella, there's something very innocent about Sue. She's not a sensual. Now, she can be an incredible flirt, and she knows what she's doing, and she's a smart girl. But it doesn't quite feel right. In a way, you know, the Victorians were sexually repressed, and there's a part of Sue that is, whether she likes to admit it or not, that is very high church in a way, very traditional. And if you remember that quote I showed you in the very beginning, that the book is all contrast. I mean, you have, you know, Sue the pagan, Sue the saint, you know, Jude the sinner, Jude the saint, Christminster the academical, Christminster slums. And so everything that is imagined, that Jude imagines, becomes kind of just a disappointment. He doesn't like the fact that, he loves that Sue is well read, and he respects that, but at the same time she's reading Swinburne. And I think that's, you know, Hardy was reading Swinburne too. It's kind of Hardy's way to sort of get in, like, I think he's getting a kick out of it. Now, he's one of those people who I think as he's writing it, he's probably laughing and, grinning sarcastically about what he's doing. And then when he later on gets criticized for it and people are burning his book, he's hurt. Like, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean any of that. He doesn't like actually being called an atheist. So Hardy's a very complicated person, but let's get to the description of Christminster. As he's reaching it, it's sort of become like nighttime, and he doesn't see it very closely. And what he sees, in a way that Hardy describes Jude, is almost like he's a ghost there. He doesn't belong there. Later he'll be asked by a police officer, "What are you doing?" He's hiding in the shadows. And that's really symbolic because he cannot actually get inside. He's always on the outside. And even in his work, he can labor, he can do that kind of work around, but he can't go inside, even though he's just as much the intellectual and probably has worked harder than anybody else, that it probably takes it for granted that they were there. So when he gets there, I'll just read this quote. It's, "Reaching the bottom, he moved along the level way between pollard growing indistinct in the twilight, and soon confronted the outmost lamps of the town. Some of these lamps, which had sent into the sky the gleam and glory that caught the strained gaze in his days of dreaming so many years ago. They winked their yellow eyes at him dubiously, as if they had been awaiting him all these years in disappointment at his tearing. They did not much want him now." And this sort of reminds me of the winking, reminds me of a description of The Great Gatsby. And in fact, if you look at the cover, a lot of time you'll see the city or something. It's personified, and it's tantalizing. It's winking at you. But it says you should have been here years ago. You're too late. It says as if you're too late. I think it was Langston Hughes that wrote, dream deferred. What happens to this dream? Does it shrivel up? Does it, dry in the sun? Does it, he has all these descriptions, and then he says, or does it just explode? And you can feel it just in the way that he writes that single line, where just, it's gone. But Jude is, he's still kind of this hopeless romantic, and he's walking around, and he's kind of talking to himself, as he's done before. Well, I thought this was an interesting, there was a couple things that are very telling about this passage. It was somebody who's commented on Christminster when they were coming up with this. I want to say it almost sounds like a hymn, but it's apostrophizing this venerable city. But look at what he says right before that. One of the specters who afterwards mourned Christminster as the home of lost causes. And I don't think I've mentioned this before, but St. Jude is the saint of lost causes. I have an icon of St. Jude where I write, because I always feel like that's a lost cause. And I pray to him. It's like, this is a lost cause, but intercede for me, St. Jude. And so isn't that interesting that somebody would make that remark about Christminster, that it's a home of lost causes, and there is St. Jude outside. And the way that this is, and I put in parentheses To Helen by Edgar Allan Poe, just give you kind of an idea, if you don't know what apostrophizing means. If you remember Helen of Troy, is this the face that cast 1,000 ships? When he's saying that to her, she's of course not there. She's, she's long gone. But it's as if she's there. It's like a tribute to her. And so is the poem. So here's like another tribute. A beautiful city of venerable, so lovely, so unravaged by its fierce intellectual life of our century, so serene. Her ineffable charm keeps her ever calling us to the true goal of us all, to the ideal, to the perfection. And it sounds like almost like a troparian hymn that you would hear in an Orthodox service, as is an ancient service, and that's why that caught my attention. Okay, so when the gates are shut and he's on the outside, and the way Hardy describes this is like he's down obscure alleys apparently never trodden now by men. It's like he's in the shadows of the building, and he can't really see it very well, but also the structure is really falling apart, and that he used words like it's rottenness of stones. It's not kept up well, and it's kind of in a Gothic way, like what you would find Gothic literature, and so he's wandering around like a ghost. And what does he do but talk to dead men, who've gone before him, and it's like he's with their ghost, and thinking of them. And there's some description, a keener regard attached to the prelates by reason of his former hopes, of them who had ample band, some men of heart, other men of head, who apologized for the church in Latin. He's talking about John Newman, the saintly author of the evening hymn, and near the great itinerant preacher, hymn writer, and zealot, shadowed like Jude by his matrimonial difficulties. He's talking about John Wesley there. So this is the group of people he wants to be having conversations with. He wants to be talking and debating doctrine, the creed, the church. That is in an entirely different level. He's talking about, this is what he's reading before he goes to bed, and if you listen to it almost, it sounds like he's reading something that's very meditative, almost like something you would read in a monastery. When I look upon the tombs of the great, every motion of envy dies in me. So this is about, what death does as far as giving us perspective. And one of the things that people will say in a monastery is that you should keep death before your eyes all the time, because it gives you perspective. So when I look upon the tombs of the great, all the materialism, all the envy, all those things that I felt like was important in life is not important. Okay, so this is the mindset of the monk. When I read the epitaphs of the beautiful, every inordinate desire goes out. When I meet the grief of parents upon tombstones, my heart melts with compassion. When I see the tombs of the parents themselves, I consider the vanity of grieving for those whom we must quickly follow. And he's meditating on these words of, teach me to live, that I may dread the grave as little as my bed. Teach me to die. That's the keeping the death ever before your eyes. And so he's wrapped up into this. He finally gets home. He has all of this kind of, It's kind of the way I feel after reading a full day or something. It's like I have all these voices kind of dancing in my head. And it puts you like almost in a sublime place. You know, sublime is not just being physically on a mountaintop. You know, Wordsworth explained that you can do this from your couch. You know, you can live at a much higher level, much meditative level. But look what happens by the end. He's thinking, you know, all these saintly things and Christian ideals and so forth. But then he says, by Jove, I had quite forgotten my sweet-faced cousin and that she's here all the time. So all that kind of goes away, you know, and my old schoolmaster too. Remember the schoolmaster in the very beginning? His words about the schoolmaster had perhaps less zest in them than the words concerning the cousin. Okay, so that's a lot for even just one little chapter, but it kind of opens that, part 2 up, and then I'll go more quickly through the text in the next few videos. All right, thanks for listening. All right, bye.